Okay, welcome everyone. I have to say, this being such a busy time of year, I'm just very delighted that everyone is here to learn. So we're starting the 5th section of 70 Faces tonight. We've actually finished 4. We went through letters, words, permutations, grammar, and there's one more, hold on. And acronyms and acrostics. Tonight we're starting a new section. We have 2 left, but these last 2 are huge. And this one tonight is juxtaposition. There are, I believe there's 8 or 9 sections in this chapter. We're on chapter 40, and we're going to begin tonight with the juxtaposition between Torah portions. Now, just a word about juxtaposition, that this is a method used extensively through all the commentaries for all the generations, seeing what is the juxtaposition between 2 Torah portions, between 2 Torah verses, between mitzvot. Why is this mitzvah next to that mitzvah? And then we'll see that there are many, many other types of juxtaposition. One, for example, is called mida keneged mida, a measure for a measure. Now, there's juxtaposition. Why are things connected? Why are they close to each other? What's the meaning? So we're going to start tonight with juxtaposition between Torah portions. We're going to just do 1 chapter tonight. And we're going to start on page 374 and 375. There is really an amazing thing, because in the beginning of 1 parsha, there's 3 different types of juxtaposition that we can learn from it. So we're going to start that the parsha before Mishpatim is Parashat Yitro, when we receive the 10 commandments. And almost the whole parsha is about coming to Sinai, all the physical phenomena that were happening, the preparations to receive the Torah, then the giving of the Torah. And then afterwards, there's a number of mitzvot that are given, and the parsha ends. The last thing it says, it talks about that when we build a tabernacle and we build an altar, there will be a ramp that will go up the altar. And it gives some explanations of this altar. And then the portion ends and the Parsha of Mishpatim begins. So Rashi says, what's the connection? And I have to mention that Rashi does this many times in his commentary. He'll begin the portion with explaining why is this portion, the beginning of this portion, next to the end of the previous one. So here he says, this is to teach us something very important, that the explanation of the ramp, this is for the service, the divine service that will happen either in the tabernacle, later in the temple, the altar of where offerings were given. And here, the beginning of Mishpatim is Ve'ela HaMishpatim Asher Tasim Lifnehem. And these are the judgments that you shall put before them. And so Rashi says, what is the highest level of court, the highest authority of judgment in Israel is called the Sanhedrin, the high court. And really, high courts around the world are based very much on the fact that we had a Sanhedrin. And our whole system of justice and the different degrees of courts that the Torah mandates became a model for court systems all over the world. So Rashi says we can learn from this that the highest authority of judgment should be right next to the temple. And that, in fact, that's what it was. The Sanhedrin sat on the Temple Mount right next to the temple, but they learn it from the juxtaposition of the end of the previous parsha of Yitro and the beginning of the parsha of Mishpatim. So that's the first juxtaposition. The second juxtaposition is based on one letter. The parsha of Mishpatim begins Ve'ele hamishpatim asher tasim lifnehem, and these are the judgments you shall put before them. So Rashi asks, why doesn't the parsha just begin? These are the judgments. Why? And these are the judgments. So he says a general principle. He says that when a parsha begins with a vav, which means and, it means that it's connected to what happened in the end or the previous portion. If it begins without a vav, just Eila, these are the judgments, or these, depending on the parsha, it means this is a whole new teaching, a whole new matter. So Rashi says, since this parsha begins Ve'ele, it's teaching us just like the 10 commandments were given at Sinai, so were all of the mitzvot in this parsha. They were also given at Sinai. And that's the whole idea that Moshe was on the mountain for 40 days, receiving the basics of the Torah. Now, he was actually on the mountain for 3 periods of 40 days. And of course, God was in touch with him, was in communication with him for 40 years. But the Rashi is saying that all of the mitzvot in this parsha, and this is, there are 53 mitzvot in this parsha. There's 3 parshas in the Torah that have the most mitzvot. This one has 53 mitzvot. And in Kitetse, in Devarim, there is 74 mitzvot in one parsha. And the other parsha that there's many mitzvot is Kedoshim in Vayikra. We're actually going to get to it after Pesach. So that's the second juxtaposition that Rashi brings, that Ve'ela and these is connecting all of these mitzvot that they were also given at Sinai. And now the third juxtaposition is more of a philosophical one. And that is that Parashat Yitro and the giving of the 10 Commandments is, of course, like a high moment. It's like a climactic, once in a history kind of revelation. And in it are the 10 Commandments, which all the mitzvot in the Torah are connected in some way to these 10 commandments. And then we go into this parsha, and it's real like nitty gritty reality of mostly different disagreements that happen between people, and lines of responsibility for actions that we take, and culpability when we do something wrong. Our ox gores our neighbor's ox, or we dig a hole in a public place and someone falls in and is injured. So the juxtaposition is, it's like kind of like day and night. Here is this incredible revelation with the 10 commandments, these 10 cardinal type of laws. And here we get to the very seeming mundane, but the teaching is it's all one Torah. There's not like, this is an important mitzvah and this is not such an important mitzvah. This is a high, elevated, mystical, spiritual mitzvah. And this is just very mundane. It doesn't work like that. The whole Torah is one entity, and everything is important. Everything is important. If someone, crashes into your car, that becomes pretty important what to do about it. Or if someone starts a fire and it spreads to your yard, this becomes like in a sense the most important thing happening right then. So this is a third type of juxtaposition, a little bit more philosophical. Now we're going to go back to page 371, and this is a unique type of juxtaposition. This is the Parashat Bayerchi. It's the last parsha of the book of Genesis, of Bereshit. And every parsha begins on its own line in the Torah, except this one. This one begins on the same line that the last one ends. And there is no other parsha like this. So the rabbis gave a name to it. It's called the Parsha Stuma, a closed parsha. It's closed because there's not a lot of room between the end of the previous parsha and the beginning of this one. So it's called a closed portion. So here again, Rashi, the first thing he comments on is this. It's really a type of juxtaposition, because every other parsha has a different type of format. And since this is a unique one, he comments on it. And he says, why is it called a closed portion? He gives two reasons. The first one is that in this parsha, Yaakov dies, and Joseph dies. And then we start a whole new book, and that's when the slavery begins. Only after Yaakov and Yosef die does the slavery begin. So Rashi says it's called a closed parsha because the hearts of the people were closed by the approaching slavery that was about to overtake them. Because once the slavery overtook them, they were like shut down into, that's what Mitzrayim means, very narrow space. So that's the first reason he gives. Why is this called a Parsha Stuma? And then he gives a second reason, that towards the middle of the Parsha, so Yaakov is on his deathbed, and he says to his sons, come and gather around, and I will reveal to you what will happen in the end of days. And then he begins to bless his children. So everyone asks, well, where is the prophecy of what's going to happen in the end of days? He just said that he's going to reveal it. So according to tradition, the Shekhinah left him at that moment, or we could say it better, is it was closed to him, the ability or the permission to reveal what would happen in the end of days. Now I say that because Rashi, if you look at all the Rashis of the blessings he gives his sons who become the 12 tribes, is many of prophetic predictions about each of the tribes is made, but very hidden. And Rashi reveals many of them. And then Kabbalah and Hasidut and the Midrash reveal others. So in a certain way, he didn't reveal technically what will happen in the end of days, but he did give over prophetic ideas as to what would happen to each of the tribes and the Jewish people throughout history. So those are the two explanations for Rashi why this parsha is a closed parsha. It's juxtaposed right next to the previous parsha. But I want to go a little bit deeper. If you'll see, this is a long piece in the book. So I want to explain it a little bit more because it's very powerful ideas. Is that we have another type of juxtaposition here in the name of the parsha, Vayechi, and he lived. So many commentaries question, like, why is it called Vayechi when most of the parsha is about him getting sick and his dying and what transpired during that period? So the whole parsha is really about the death of Yaakov, yet it's called Vayechi. So this in itself, again, is a type of philosophical juxtaposition, where the theme of the parsha is one thing, but the name is very different. So we have to probe into it. So it says that he lived Vayechi 17 years in Eretz Mitzrayim. 17 is Gematria Tov, which is good. And so it meant that in Vayechi, it didn't say he dwelt or he like camped out for 17 years. He lived. And the word chai is a very potent word. And so it's given over that these are, in a sense, the best 17 years of his life. He's reunited with his whole family, and especially with Yosef, who he thought was dead for 22 years. And now he's not fighting Esav, he's not fighting Lavan, he's not fighting Shechem, and he's with his children and grandchildren. And it's Vayechi. So we can understand that even though he's close to passing away, in a sense, these are the best years of his life. But there's even a deeper idea here, and that is that, as we said, Yaakov had prophetic powers. And so he already saw the slavery coming. He saw exile coming. He saw all of Jewish history. Actually, it's said that at the dream of the ladder, it was already revealed to him all of Jewish history. And one of the reasons given why permission was taken away from him or not granted him to reveal what would happen in the end of days is that if the Jewish people would have known what they had to go through and how long it would take for Mashiach to come, it would have been very difficult for the Jewish people to hold on. We're always anticipating Mashiach coming. We're always anticipating a redeemed world. And if we would have known back then that it would be like 3,600 years till today, where would we get the strength to hold on? Part of our strength is we really believe that, and it can happen at any time, that the world can be redeemed. So Yaakov saw that most of Jewish history would happen in exile. And so he wanted to show, Vayechi, he wanted to show that even in exile, even with upcoming slavery, even when things aren't so bad in exile, we could really live. The Talmud, the Babylonian Talmud came out of exile. Chassidut came out of exile. A lot of Kabbalah came out of exile. So he wanted to pave the way that even in exile, we could live. Now it's what we call a double-edged sword of getting too comfortable in exile. So Yaakov showed us how to live in exile, but remember, before he died, he said, he said to Yosef, promise me you will bring me back to Israel for burial. There's no way I want to be buried outside of Israel. That is the place for the Jewish people. And Yosef did the same thing. Before he passed away, he also expressed that he wanted to be brought back to Israel for burial. Now, Baruch Hashem, we can live here and not just be buried here. One final layer of a closed parsha. The book of Shemot begins, of course, the slavery, and then the Exodus, receiving the Torah, and then the 40 years in the desert. At the end, we prepare to come into the Holy Land. So it's given over that the whole story of us going down into Egypt and then struggling and receiving the Torah, which is, we'll call it a roadmap to spiritual and physical freedom, and then being prepared to enter the Holy Land. This is a metaphor, an allegory for each individual soul. That the soul coming down into the body is like the Jewish people going down to Egypt. Egypt in Hebrew, Mitzrayim, means a narrow place. So existentially, when a soul comes down into a body, we're taking in potential, an infinite soul, and putting it into a very finite body, in many cases a frail body, in a very material, physical world full of challenges and trials and tribulations. This is like going down into Egypt. And so that on a deep, deep mystical level is what it means, a parsha stuma, a closed parsha. Because for the soul to come down into a body is like entering into a closed parsha. But again, Yaakov shows us how to live. And the Torah is the roadmap teaching us how to live. And we trust that God feels that by a soul coming into a body, ultimately it gains from it. With all of the hardship that we go through in this world, we have a core belief that all of the challenges that a soul in a body goes through ultimately is for the good of the soul, and is part of the purpose of creation, is that we are meant to make a place for God to dwell in this world. And that's why l'chaim, that's what Yaakov was trying to teach in the Torah, Bayerchi, that through everything we have to remember l'chaim. Okay, now we'll go to another one on page 375. So this is a beautiful one. At the end of Parashat Ki Tisa, it talks about how Moshe came down with the tablets of the law. These are the second tablets. And the parsha ends, but it describes that when he came down, his face was radiant. Moshe's face was radiant so much that people were afraid to look at him. It was so awesome. And if people have ever been in the presence of a holy person, so we have a little bit of understanding this kind of awe to be in the presence of a holy person. And I'll just mention, because this, I think it's Monday night, is Yud Aleph Nisan, and this is the 120th birthday, or would have been the 120th birthday of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. And there are many different events and commemorations happening around the world especially in Chabad, but I watched one the other night. It was just quite amazing. And so I'm just mentioning this because the first time I ever experienced this was with the Lubavitcher Rebbe, because I was on my way to Eretz Yisrael, and I was I wouldn't even call myself a Baal Tshuva at that point. I was just kind of getting into it enough that I wanted to come to Israel. And I went to 770 right before I left for Israel. And I was there for Yud Tet B'Kislev. This is like the biggest event of the year in Chabad. And I had heard a lot about the Lubavitcher Rebbe, but I don't know, I just took it all with a grain of salt. I didn't really integrate who he was and what he was doing. And I'll just never forget, there were thousands of people there, very crunched together. And I was very fortunate because we got a table like right in front of the Rebbe. And it was just so noisy and crazy. And then all of a sudden it became completely quiet. You could have heard a pin drop. And I didn't know what was happening. Like in 1 second, it went from like pandemonium to absolute quiet. And so I look up, and the Rebbe walked into the room. And it was like Kriyat Yam Suf. It was like there was no room to move. And all of a sudden, like the sea parted, and the Rebbe came in, and I felt what I'm trying to describe here, like an absolute awe. I had never experienced it before. I didn't have any way to understand the aspect of awesome holiness. And so I'm giving that over because in a day or two is his 120th birthday. So Moshe Rabbeinu's face was shining. This is the famous beams that Michelangelo made. He didn't quite understand the Hebrew and what it really meant. And then the parsha ends. And then the next parsha is Vayakel. And that's where Moshe begins to give over the laws of building the Mishkan. But it begins with call it the warning about keeping Shabbat and not transferring a fire. And the reason is so everyone knows that even the holy task of building the tabernacle does not supersede keeping Shabbat. And so the Baal HaTurim makes a beautiful juxtaposition. He says that just like these two parshas are juxtaposed, the end, Moshe Rabbeinu's face beaming light, and the beginning, talking about Shabbat, tells us that on Shabbat, if we properly connect to Shabbat, our whole face changes. Our whole being changes. And so I want to relate another personal story, again, of seeing this. I spent off and on many Shabbats with Reb Shlomo Karlbach, and he kept a torrid schedule. Sometimes he did 2 or 3 concerts in a day. He was constantly in airplanes, airports, cabs, going to this concert or that teaching or this simcha. And it was just constant. He was constantly on the move. And many times when he was in the Moshav, I would visit him on Friday, and he was exhausted. He was exhausted. And I remember thinking many times, And of course, we were having a big Shabbat on the Moshav. And I remember thinking many times, is like, how is he going to get it together to now lead this Shabbat where so many people came to be with him? But I'll never forget, every Shabbat, doesn't matter how exhausted he looked a couple hours before Shabbos, when he came into the Beit Knesset for Shabbos, his face was beaming. It really was. And that's exactly what the Baal HaTurim is saying, that the power of Shabbat, it makes our soul shines out from our physical body. We actually look somewhat different. There's a number of famous stories of different rabbis who they describe them as being a head taller on Shabbat. However, we understand that. Like during the week, like we're kind of like maybe bent over a little bit, but on Shabbat, like our statue just rises. So that's just a beautiful juxtaposition. The next one is on page 377. And this is in the end of Parashat Bayerchi in the book of Numbers. So this is the story when Miriam and Aaron complain about Moshe, about his relationship with his wife, and he had separated from his wife, and they couldn't understand why he did that, and they were complaining. And God comes and explains the difference between their prophecy, because both Aaron and Miriam were prophets. But God comes and explains the difference between Moshe and all other prophets that would ever come. It's a very, very important piece about prophecy. And then what happens is Miriam contracts leprosy. For those who are here in the beginning, the song that we played was because of this last week's parsha was Mitzora. We'll call it the leprous person, even though the sages say it was not leprosy, but that's the term that most people use. And she became leprous, and she had to go outside of the camp. And so we're told a number of things. First of all, we're told that the camp didn't move until she came out of isolation, because even though she was, we'll call it being punished, or there were consequences for her complaining, it didn't take away from her greatness. We're all human, we all make mistakes. And so everyone had to wait for her to come out of isolation. That tells us the greatness of Miriam. And I'll just mention is because tomorrow is the 10th of Nisan. And on the 10th of Nisan is, according to tradition, is when Miriam passed away. And for many, many years, it was considered a fast day. That she was on such a level, and all the water in the desert was considered in her merit. So that's how the parsha ends. And then is Parashat Shlach Lecha. This is the whole story of the spies. And so it's brought down by many commentaries. Here, Miriam gets Sara'at, leprosy, we'll call it leprosy, because she spoke Lashon Hara. She spoke negatively about Moshe. And the result was she got Sara'at. And so the commentaries say, why didn't the spies learn from this? Because the two parshas are right next to each other. And the whole camp had to wait for Miriam because she spoke Lashon Hara. And yet the spies come back after 40 days, and they talk very, in a certain sense, that they said that the land is beautiful, it's fruitful, it's incredible, but the people there are too strong, we'll never be able to conquer it. We shouldn't go. It's a losing battle. And the people said, okay, maybe we should go back to Egypt. It was a disaster. And so the juxtaposition is here, they didn't learn. They should have learned, and they didn't learn. Okay, now we're going to do, this is on page 379. As always, we can only pick a few examples. There are many, many examples. In the upcoming weeks, we will be dealing with the juxtaposition of verses, the juxtaposition of mitzvot. So I'm ending also with a very, very, very deep one, very profound juxtaposition. Here, it's not just the juxtaposition between two parshas, but it's the juxtaposition between the end of the Torah and the beginning of the Torah. And some of what I say may be familiar to some of you, because it's given over in many commentaries. Hopefully we'll go a little bit deeper, is that the last letter in the Torah is a lamed, and the first letter of the Torah is a bet. It spells lev, spells heart. And we know that this juxtaposition is, in a sense, lived out on Simchas Torah. On Simchas Torah, the day after Sukkot, Shmini Atzeret, we read the end of the Torah, and then if we only have one Sefer Torah, we roll the whole Torah back to the beginning. If you have another Sefer Torah, you just read from a separate Sefer Torah. But the idea is that we read the end of the Torah, and immediately we begin the Torah again from the beginning. And so these two letters are really juxtaposed. The lamed of Zota Bracha, the last letter of the Torah, and the first letter. So let's see some of the meaning of this. So on a very simple level, it's teaching us what is the purpose of the Torah. Here at the end, this is what Sefer Yitro says, Na'ut sofan b'techilatan b'sofan. The end is wedged in the beginning, and the beginning in the end. And this is like the classic example, how the end of the Torah through this drasha is connected to the beginning of the Torah. So we know that from Sefer Yetzirah, where it says, Na'ut sofan b'techilatan b'sofan, the end is wedged in the beginning, the end. The first thing in the Sefer Yetzirah is, with 32 pathways of wisdom, God created the world. But before I go into that, I jumped ahead one step, is what's the purpose of the Torah? So some people say, Lev Tov. After all is said and done, are you a mensch or not? Did the Torah help you be a good person? Did the Torah teach you how to be a good person? To have a good heart? And we're actually told that this is very appropriate, because the day after Pesach, we begin counting Sfira to Omer. And we count 49 days. And the gematria of Lev Tov, a good heart, is exactly 49. So we're told what's all the work of Sfira to Omer to get from Pesach to receiving the Torah at Sinai is, the bottom line is to have a good heart, to be a good person, to have a Lev Tov. So here we see the end of the Torah in the beginning is also teaching us this idea. Okay, so back to this idea from the Sefer Yetzirah, that with 32 wondrous pathways of wisdom, God created the world. So this is hinted to in the end of the Torah and the beginning of the Torah, because the beginning of the Torah is, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And so the fact that the end is juxtaposed to the beginning and spells Lev is a hint to the actual recreation of the world. Every year, in a sense, the world is recreated. The Arizal taught, even though we have the idea of linear time, past, present, and future. But the Ari said that every Rosh Hashanah, a new energy comes into the world. Now, obviously, the present and the future is going to be connected to the past. And that, in fact, that's the whole thing of the judgment on Rosh Hashanah is, what did we do last year? Our judgment for the coming year is going to be based on that. But there's more than just linear time. And the Arizal says every Rosh Hashanah, a whole new energy comes into the world that's never been here before. Hasidus comes and teaches every day is a new energy. We say it in our prayers every day. God renews the work of creation every single day. And then Kabbalah and Hasidut and science comes along and says it's every split second the world is being renewed. So this is hinted to in the last letter of the Torah and the first letter of the Torah, being the 32 pathways of wisdom. Okay, so now let's go one step deeper here, one step deeper, and that is based on the last Rashi, on the last words of the Torah. The last verse of the Torah says, all the wonders that Moshe did, all the wonders and miracles that Moshe did, le'enei kol Yisrael, in the eyes of all of Israel. And that's how the Torah ends. The lamed is from the word Yisrael, le'enei kol Yisrael, the eyes of all of Israel. So before we do the Rashi, first of all, as far as the juxtaposition, so many commentaries say, read the last words of the Torah and the first words of the Torah as if they're one flow. And so it's read, Le'enei kol Yisrael bereshit bara Elokim et hashmayim et haaretz. In the eyes of all of Israel, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So what does that mean? What it means is, or one perspective, is that there's a midrash that says that before God created the world, he took counsel with the souls of the tzaddikim. So everyone asks, there's no world, there's no souls, there's no time, there's no space, there's only God. What does it mean he took counsel with the souls of the tzaddikim? So there are many levels of answer here, but one of them is a different midrash that says, Yisrael Allah b'machshava techila. When it arose in God's mind to create the world, the first thing that came to his mind was Israel. And so when it says he took counsel with Israel, it's like he was having an inner dialogue with himself, because the souls are coming from God. An actual part of God above. So God was taking counsel with the future souls of the tzaddikim that would come from him. And so that's what it means to read it in the eyes of all of Israel. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So this is a very deep understanding. And this we see when we make Kiddush on Shabbos. When we make Kiddush on Shabbos, in essence, what are we doing? We're giving testimony that not just that we believe that God created the heaven and the earth, and he rested on the seventh day, but we know it. Because how can you give testimony on something you didn't see? And go in any court, if someone tries to give testimony and they're cross-examined, like, well, did you see this? Well, no, I wasn't really there. I heard about it. Well, they're not going to accept that kind of testimony. So this idea of making Kiddush is that by us giving testimony, it's like saying Le'enei Kol Yisrael. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth in the eyes of all of Israel, because in a deep, deep, deep way, our souls were there. We were there from the beginning. That's what it means, that God took counsel with the souls of Israel. These are very, very profound ideas. And we're going to end with one more amazing thing, is the Rashi on the last verse. So when it says all of the miracles and wonders that Moshe did in the eyes of all of Israel. So if we didn't have Rashi, we would think Moshe, obviously the plagues were coming from God, but Moshe, it appeared as he was the agent of all the plagues, and the splitting of the sea, and bringing water out of the rock, and all of these incredible miracles. According to the Talmud, he stopped the sun in the war against Amalek. So that's what we would think naturally. Rashi says an amazing thing. What are the wonders and miracles that he did? He broke the tablets. What does Rashi mean? He broke the tablets. And what's connected is that there's a verse where God is talking to Moshe about the broken luchot. And he said about the luchot, asher shibarta, that you broke. So the Talmud says, remember, this is one of our methodologies, don't read it one way, read it another way. So the sages say, don't read it asher shibarta, read it yesher kochacha asher shibarta. Like, good work, Moshe. Like, great, you did the right thing by breaking the tablets. So this is an amazing Rashi. This is the last Rashi of the Torah. And he's hinting at something that we never would have thought of. So on a deep level, and I'll mention this because we mentioned it last week, that sometimes if someone is talking what's called Ruach HaKodesh, with divine inspiration, and the tradition is that Rashi wrote his commentary with Ruach HaKodesh, with divine inspiration, is that one doesn't always know the ramifications of exactly what they're giving over. Sometimes yes, sometimes no, and a big gray area in between. So here, now Rashi lived 500 years before the Arizal, and about 100 years or so before the Zohar became public. And that's where we have the concept of Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. And so here, in a very, very deep way, what is being hinted to is, here's the end of the Torah and the beginning of the Torah. The Arizal says that when we start the Torah with Bereshit bara Elokim et Shemaim v'et haaretz, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, it's talking about Olam HaTikun. And that's why the second verse, the world of rectification, which is made up of the broken vessels of the previous world. We've discussed this a number of times. Shvirat HaKelim, the breaking of the vessels. And that's why the second verse of the Torah is the haaretz haita tohu v'vohu, and the land was tohu, and this is the previous world called olam tohu, the world of chaos. So here there's a deep, deep hint that the Torah is ending with this idea of Moshe breaking the tablets, which is in a sense a reenactment of the breaking of the vessels of creation. And here, then it begins immediately, Bereshit bara Elokim et Shemaim v'et haaretz. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. So this is a deep hint to Shvirat HaKelim that Rashi, whether he understood how it could be interpreted in the future, it's not clear why he felt that he should write that, and not just say he did the plagues and he split the sea, but that he wrote this is somewhat mysterious. But one of the ways we can interpret is the way that I'm trying to give it over here. So here we see this incredible juxtaposition that we've now explained on many, many different levels between the end of the Torah and the beginning of the Torah. So we'll end with a blessing that, and I do want to mention that we will not be learning during, hopefully we'll all be learning, but we'll not have this class during Pesach nor the week after. For 2 weeks, we will not be having class, and then we will have class again. You'll get reminders in the email and the WhatsApps and Telegram. So I just want to bless everyone with a meaningful Passover, a meaningful Pesach, full of joy and great anticipation how much we need redemption in the world now. We say this every year, because it's true, but every year there's great anticipation of Mashiach coming and the kind of world that we all really want to live in.